Hello, my name is Silvano Coriani. I'm a program manager in the Azure Postgres team. And welcome to this series on PostgreSQL for SQL Server Professional. Okay, in this video, let's dig a bit deeper into the history of these two products. So let's start from SQL Server. As you can see from this slide, the first kind of public release of SQL Server 1.0 was in May 1989, and this was a release for OS2. And this first bit basically came out of the agreement that Microsoft had with Sybase. For again, branding and reselling SQL Server bits, followed by a new release in 1990, and the SQL Server 4.2 version A and version B for still for OS2 in 1992 and 93. September 1993 actually was the release of SQL Server 4.21 for Windows NT. This is actually the first release that I played with, but I should say that it was with SQL Server 6.0 in 1995 that actually SQL Server became one of the kind of most interesting options in basically installing and using relational databases on the Windows platform. And then, following releases were, SQL Server 6.5 in 96, and finally in 1998, SQL Server 7.0, which is a super important release for SQL Server, because that's where most of the rewrite of the internals of the engine, query processor and storage engine, were released. And following a little bit kind of the different technologies that were introduced, again, starting from 6.0, this is where technologies like replications, for example, were released. Enterprise Manager, that was the first kind of a graphical user interface to connect and query and manage SQL Server. In 6.5, this is where distributed transactions were introduced, for example, and also failover clustering debuted for the first time, together with row-level locking for insert operations. As I was saying, SQL Server 7.0 was basically the first kind of big re-architecture of the SQL Server engine, with new things like new page formats, the lock manager and the query processor were completely brand new. It was also the first release where additional services, like, for example, SQL Server analysis services, were introduced together in the same box of the relational engine. SQL Server 2000, super important release, 64-bit support was introduced. XML support for start going above the relational paradigm and start introducing some more complex data types. Also reporting services, big success for creating reporting solutions on top of the SQL Server relational engine itself. Then we had like a 5 years gap because, again, SQL Server 2005, codename Yukon, was a huge, big, again, step forward. I wouldn't say complete re-architecture, but this is where, for example, the SQL OS concept was introduced, basically a layer between the relational engine and the Windows operating system at the time, managing things like, memory, like thread scheduling and such, introducing NUMA support for processor architectures that were starting to actually have kind of memory affinity with the different cores. Big news was the introduction of dynamic management views, or DMVs, to actually look inside the engine from a debuggability and troubleshooting perspective. SQL CLR, so the introduction of .NET Common Language Runtime within the SQL Server engine to actually extend, create new types and create new managed functions. SQL Server integration services, again, brand new ETL kind of platform within, again, the same box, and SQL Server Management Studio also debuted in this release. And then a series of, I would say, more kind of consolidation releases, like 2008. Again, extended events as a great platform for troubleshooting and for, debugging SQL Server applications, transparent data encryption, for example, and, always on, introduced in SQL Server 2012, was another big step together with column stores for accommodating analytical workloads on top of the same kind of OLTP technologies that were backing SQL Server since forever. In 2014, also the introduction of new kind of in-memory OLTP capabilities. So in-memory tables and such, again, for speeding up specific workloads. Query Store as a again kind of system and a capability to help. For example, monitoring SQL Server instances over time. Look at, for example, query regressions, query plan regressions, and so on. And I would say, another big moment was in SQL Server 2017 with the basically porting of the SQL Server bits on Linux and on kind of Docker containers. This was a big change. With if you search on YouTube or online, you will see a lot of interesting documents on how the SQL engine was actually ported on Linux, while still kind of maintaining the original architecture, the original tools for debuggability purposes and such super important aspect. And then 2019 and 2022, that were, I would say, the kind of level of maturity in terms of cloud integration, right? And new capabilities like, for example, accelerated database recovery, which is, for example, turned on by default on Azure SQL Database in the cloud, and other kind of cloud-connected capabilities. And so these were kind of the evolutions of SQL Server over the last kind of 30 years, I should say. Postgres, on the other hand, again, it has its roots in a different kind of database technology called Ingress that was developed in the mid-80s in the University of California, Berkeley, by Professor Michael Stonebreaker. Actually, that Ingress technology was also kind of at the origins of the SQL Server Sybase bits. So we can say to a certain degree that SQL Server and Postgres are sharing, some kind of family tree, as with Ingress as the kind of common ancestor, if you will. So the first kind of release of Postgres was in 1989. So basically in line pretty much with what we have seen for SQL Server, but again, it was in 1996 where basically, given the introduction of kind of more strict kind of SQL compliance and capabilities, that Postgres was actually renamed as PostgreSQL. Right, to support as a testament of the SQL standard support that became more relevant, right? And the community development evolved over the years, and version 7.0 was released in 2000. And it was starting to introduce things like, for example, foreign keys, nested transactions, And over the years, again, the community has kind of updated and created several versions. Nowadays, we are at the version 16 with 16.2 as kind of the latest minor release. But this version 17 is actually along the way and will debut later as a kind of the latest release. Ok, 2, 1.